Imagine the marble halls of the United States Capitol at first light. Silence, broken only by the echo of a cane tapping on the stone floor. There walks John Quincy Adams, not as a retired head of state, but as a humbled former president, now a congressman whose voice still carries the weight of history and conscience. In an era when slavery was poisoning the nation's soul, Adams became something extraordinary. A man older than most of his colleagues, yet unbowed and unafraid to speak the truth, even when others tried to silence him. After losing the presidency in 1828, Adams could have faded into quiet dignity. Instead, he elected himself to the House of Representatives, where he spent nearly 2 decades wrestling with the nation's greatest moral crisis. Southern lawmakers imposed a gag rule to forbid any debate on slavery, but Adams, soon nicknamed Old Man Eloquent, refused to be muzzled. He stood again and again to present petitions calling for freedom and justice, insisting that the right to petition and the truth must never be suppressed. And when the fate of a group of Africans seized aboard the slave ship Amistad reached the Supreme Court, Adams, the seasoned diplomat-turned-lawyer, argued fiercely for their freedom, and won. This is not just a chapter of political maneuvering. It is the story of a man who faced down silence, oppression, and history itself. Snuggle in as we travel back to a time when one voice, persistent, principled, and unmistakable, helped shape the course of a nation. If you're passionate about history and untold legacies, hit subscribe and leave a comment with what you want to explore next. Chapter 1. Return from Defeat. A president finds a new purpose. As the sun set on the last year of the 1820s, the American Republic stood at a crossroads of changing political tides. In 1828, after 4 years in the White House marked by bold ideas and fierce opposition, John Quincy Adams faced the judgment of the voters. He had campaigned for a second term against Andrew Jackson, a fiery war hero whose appeal to the expanding electorate reshaped the nature of presidential politics. Jackson's triumph was emphatic. He carried the nation with overwhelming support, leaving Adams decisively defeated. Adams's coalition, rooted in New England and the emerging National Republican faction, could not withstand Jackson's broad, popular appeal. Jackson captured 178 electoral votes to Adams's 83, a stark sign of shifting political currents in the early republic. Adams returned to Massachusetts, his dignity intact, but his ambitions for national leadership crushed. He might have chosen quiet retreat, spending his days among the boughs and blossoms of his family estate, reflecting on a life marked by diplomacy, war, and governance. Indeed, as he tended to his orchard and gardens, he likened political service to the work of a careful gardener, planting trees whose shade he might never enjoy, yet whose growth spoke of hope for future generations. Yet in the quiet of those fields, something persistent stirred in Adams's mind. Retirement did not suit a man who had spent his life in the forging of public life, and he believed sincerely that service was the highest calling of a citizen, regardless of former rank. When local leaders approached him in 1830 with a surprising invitation to stand for a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives, Adams did not recoil. Instead, he accepted, writing with characteristic resolve that no person could be degraded by serving the people as a representative in Congress, and noting that an ex-president serving alongside common citizens was no dishonor. The election that autumn confirmed what many in southeastern Massachusetts already knew. They had chosen a leader whose experience and moral compass far exceeded his title. Adams won handily, becoming and remaining
the only former president in U.S. history elected to the House of Representatives. What began as a seeming descent in public stature proved instead to be a turning point. Far from relinquishing his voice, Adams was positioning himself for a different kind of struggle, one that would not unfold in the grandeur of the White House, but in the daily debates of the House chamber. It was there, amid the desks and doors of Congress, that his second and perhaps greatest chapter of service would unfold.
Chapter 2. The Halls of the Common. From President to People's House. When John Quincy Adams stepped once more into the United States Capitol, it was not into the stately East Room of the White House, but into the bustling chamber of the House of Representatives, the crowded, loud, ordinary People's House of American government. This was a very different world from the polished halls of presidential audiences and state dinners the sixth president had known only a few years earlier. Yet as he ascended those worn steps in 1831, Adams was content. Having left the presidency behind after his election defeat in 1828, he now returned to the scene of everyday democracy with a renewed sense of purpose. The House chamber was a place of constant motion. Members arrived in groups, voices rising in heated debate or laughter. Clerks shuffled paperwork. Visitors crowded behind the rail. Adams, now in his early 60s, once the nation's chief executive, was just Representative Adams here, the seat of everyday governance and parliamentary grit. Many of his colleagues were younger by decades. The Capitol corridors echoed with the clatter of daily legislative life, contrasting sharply with the formal pomp of presidential receptions he had once hosted. Still, there was something deeply democratic, deeply earnest about the place, and Adams embraced it wholeheartedly. Colleagues soon recognized Adams not by his former title, but by his eloquence and fierce dedication. More than once, he stood before the chamber to articulate positions not on broad policy abstractions, but on the fundamental rights of citizens to petition their government, to seek redress, and to speak truth to power. In these opening years, the issue that would define his post-presidential career was already stirring: the flood of anti-slavery petitions that abolitionist societies sent to Congress. Southern members reacted with alarm, leading to the controversial gag rule, designed to table without discussion any petitions on slavery. Adams saw this rule as a violation of constitutional rights and the spirit of the Republic, and it became his first great legislative battlefield. There was a beautiful symmetry and irony in the transition. As president, Adams had championed broad national programs like infrastructure and scientific advancement, only to find limited success. Now, as a representative among many, he found his voice resonated with deeper moral clarity and drew on the very essence of Republican governance: the right of the people to be heard by their government. Day by day, bill by bill, petition by petition, he worked the ancient instruments of debate and committee to protect constitutional liberties. Though the chamber was sometimes fractious, sometimes indifferent, Adams knew it was here, in the everyday business of the common house, that he could reshape the nation's moral compass. Thus began his second and most consequential act of public service, not as President of the United States, but as constant, persistent advocate for the rights and dignity of all, voiced from the desk of a representative. Chapter 3. Old Man Eloquent. The Rise of a Relentless Voice. If there was one thing that astonished Washington insiders in the 1830s, it wasn't that a former president had chosen to serve in the chamber of ordinary legislators. It was how that former president spoke. In the rough-and-tumble world of the House of Representatives, voices rose and fell with partisan tension, military appropriations, tariff battles, and every issue of the day. Yet when John Quincy Adams stood, a hush would descend. In time, colleagues, friends and foes alike, came to call him Old Man Eloquent. The sobriquet wasn't a simple tribute to his age. Adams was well into his 60s when he entered Congress, older than most of the men he served alongside, and his hair was white with years of service to the young republic. But eloquence was not merely about mellifluous language. In Adams's case, it was rooted in moral fervor, breadth of knowledge, and unyielding determination. Whether he spoke of constitutional principles, citizens' rights, or the inescapable injustice of slavery, he did so with a sincerity and force that commanded attention. Some contemporaries noted that Adams was not the kind of orator who delighted in theatrical flourish or grand rhetorical arcs. Capital historians later pointed out that he lacked the breathtaking phrases of a Daniel Webster or the theatrical aura of a Henry Clay. But what set him apart was a deep reservoir of intellectual authority and moral conviction. A voice shaped by decades of diplomacy, law, and a lifelong devotion to the Republic. When Adams rose to speak, even his adversaries leaned in, not always in agreement, but in respect for the force of his argument and the weight of his reputation. His nickname also reflected the unusual nature of his persistence. While many representatives spoke at length on narrow questions of local interest, Adams repeatedly brought before the House issues that others wished could be buried, especially the flood of anti-slavery petitions pouring in from Northern citizens. He challenged procedural limits, questioned gag rules designed to mute debate on slavery, and day after day reminded the chamber of its constitutional duties. To Southern congressmen and pro-slavery advocates, his voice was a persistent thorn. To abolitionists and many Northern citizens, it was a clarion call. Reporters and chroniclers of the era took note too. Newspapers in Washington began referring to him as Old Man Eloquent, not with mockery, but with a measure of admiration, a recognition that this aging statesman, standing among a house of energetic legislators, wielded words as his greatest weapon. By the late 1830s and into the 1840s, that nickname had stuck in Capitol corridors and printing rooms alike, a testament to a man who refused to be silenced in a nation increasingly polarized by the issue of human bondage. Thus, the title Old Man Eloquent was more than a moniker. It was a reflection of a moral voice that would not relent, echoing through debates on liberty, rights, and the very meaning of the American experiment. Chapter 4. The First Petitions. A nation's voices find a champion. In the quiet bustle of the early 1830s, petitions began to arrive at the Capitol like tides rising with the seasons. Ordinary citizens, farmers, artisans, ministers, and women's societies in towns and cities across the North filled wagon loads of parchment and inked signatures with one clear, urgent plea: end slavery. These were not petitions from elites alone, but the voices of thousands of people seeking redress from their government on a moral question that shook the conscience of the young republic. It was a flood of democratic expression that the House of Representatives had never before seen. At first, many members of Congress simply noted the petitions and moved on. But by 1835 to 1836, the volume had swelled dramatically. Tens of thousands of anti-slavery petitions, some accounts suggest well over 130,000 in a single session of Congress, flowed in from northern states asking for discussion and action on abolition or the mitigation of the institution of slavery. At the center of this storm stood John Quincy Adams, the former president whose second career in the House of Representatives had already begun to define him anew.
Adams did not hide his belief that slavery was incompatible with the nation's founding principles. But in this moment, his focus was sharper and more constitutional: the right of the people to petition their government for a redress of grievances, guaranteed in the First Amendment. While Adams himself was not yet an abolitionist in the full political sense, he did not call for immediate emancipation across the entire South. He saw something even more fundamental at stake. He insisted that to suppress the petitions was to silence the people themselves. What good was the right to petition if Congress could simply declare the subject off-limits? The response from pro-slavery representatives was swift and fierce. Southern congressmen, most prominently led by figures like James Henry Hammond of South Carolina, feared that these petitions threatened their property rights and regional power. In response, they pushed the House to adopt what became known as the gag rule, a series of resolutions that automatically tabled, set aside, all petitions relating to slavery without discussion, reading, or referral to committee. Adams, undaunted, became the principal voice against this rule. He stood before the chamber again and again, not merely introducing petitions, but demanding that the House face them, even when rules and majority sentiment tried to silence debate. He treated each petition as a sacred document of civic voice, an expression of conscience that no representative, no matter how powerful, had the right to suppress. In the early phases of this struggle, Adams did not yet overturn the gag rule.
But he became the unavoidable funnel for the anti-slavery movement's petitions, carrying the weight of ordinary Americans into the corridors of power and refusing to let them be buried in legislative silence. His actions marked the beginning of a long and dramatic contest over free speech, constitutional rights, and the moral soul of the nation. Chapter 5: Storm Clouds, the Gag Rule, and a Constitutional Crisis. As the 1830s unfold, the best 46 Smorth confonements that all over the scripture of the Stort, and the group of the Lev is 2022. As the 1830s unfold, the completed fornoth of the scripture has a noose through the gag rule. As the 1830s unfold, the completed fornoth of the scripture is 2023 of a form of gag rule, and firmly in the storm. As the 1830s unfold, the completed fornoth of the scripture has been demonstrate from the gag rule. As the 1830s unfold, the completed fornoth of the scripture is 2023 of a form of gag rule. As the 1830s unfold, the completed fornoth of the scripture is 2023 of a form of gag rule. As the 1830s unfold, the completed fornoth of the scripture is 2023 of a form of gag rule. As the 1830s unfold, the completed fornoth of the scripture is 2023 of a form of gag rule. As the 1830s unfold, the completed fornoth of the scripture is 2023 of a form of gag rule. As the 1830s unfold, the completed fornoth of the scripture is 2023 of a form of gag rule. Anne's simply a place where representatives gathered to manage the day-to-day business of the Republic, became the stage for a constitutional storm unlike any other in antebellum American history. By 1836, tens of thousands of anti-slavery petitions had descended upon the House of Representatives, driven by citizens across the North who believed it was time for the nation to confront the moral blight of slavery. Many of these petitions asked Congress to take action to abolish or restrict the institution of slavery, especially in the District of Columbia. Faced with this flood of public appeals, Southern representatives sought a radical solution. They would simply stop the discussion before it began. In May 1836, the House passed a set of resolutions that included what would come to be known as the Gag Rule. Introduced by Henry L. Pinckney of South Carolina,
This rule demanded that all petitions related to slavery be automatically tabled without reading, consideration, or debate. In effect, it made the very act of raising these petitions irrelevant in the chamber, as if public opinion on such a defining topic could be erased by procedural edict. To many in the South, and among pro-slavery members of Congress, this was a soothing measure, a way to quiet what they saw as disruptive agitation and to protect the peculiar institution from political peril. But to others, including many in the North, it was something far more serious. It was an assault on the First Amendment itself, a direct violation of the constitutional right of citizens to petition their government for redress of grievances. At the center of the ensuing crisis stood John Quincy Adams. Though many in the room remembered him as a former president, he now wielded no more formal power than any other representative from Massachusetts. Yet he refused to be silenced. Adams immediately denounced the gag rule as unconstitutional and an affront to the Republic's founding principles. On May 27, 1836, he submitted a motion formally declaring the gag rule unconstitutional, grounding his argument in the constitutional guarantee of free petition and public debate. For Adams, this was not a mere procedural squabble, but a fundamental confrontation over the nature of American democracy. He argued that if citizens could be barred from raising the most urgent moral issue of the age, then no constitutional right was safe. His speeches against the gag rule drew on history, law, and a moral clarity that cut through the rising tensions of the era. Southerners and pro-slavery members, however, were not simply goaded into silence. They doubled down, renewing the gag rule session after session. By 1840, the rule had become a standing House rule, not merely a temporary resolution, and its force was to prohibit even the reception of anti-slavery petitions.
Despite this, Adams persisted, turning every procedural maneuver into an opportunity to challenge the rule's legitimacy. As he worked to expose its implications, that a key part of democratic engagement could be dismissed with a parliamentary motion, he ignited debates not just about slavery itself, but about the constitutionally protected rights of every citizen to be heard. This period of legislative struggle was more than a storm cloud gathering over a chamber floor. It was a warning of the coming tempest that would soon break over the nation itself. The gag rule would remain in place for 8 long years, but in resisting it, Adams carved out a moral battleground, laying the groundwork for a deeper collision between liberty and bondage in the decades ahead. Chapter 6. Fight for the Right to Speak. Parliamentary Resistance and Legal Ingenuity. Once the gag rule was adopted in the committee train, then noticed by House of Representatives in 1836, a series of parliamentary resolutions automatically tabling any petition related to slavery without discussion or referral, the chamber seemed to have sealed its lips on the most urgent moral issue of the age. For many lawmakers, that was exactly the point. Southern members and their allies believed that silence was safety, that if slavery was not spoken of in the nation's legislative heart, it might endure unchallenged. But in the dim glow of candlelight and early session hours, John Quincy Adams, former president turned congressman, stood defiantly against this enforced silence. What followed was not merely speechifying, but a masterclass in parliamentary maneuver, constitutional argument, and raw moral courage. Adams's initial response to the gag rule was direct and unyielding. On May 27, 1836, he submitted a motion declaring the gag rule unconstitutional, arguing that it violated not only the First Amendment's right to petition, but also the ancient democratic tradition that citizens could bring grievances before their government's representatives. To Adams,
the gag rule didn't merely stifle debate, it struck at the very roots of Republican government. "The freedom of debate has been stifled in this House," he declared, insisting that the rule trampled both the House's own procedures and the rights of his constituents. But parliamentary declarations alone could not shatter the wall of procedural silence. Southern representatives repeatedly renewed and strengthened the gag rule, extending it through successive Congresses and, by 1840, turning it into a standing rule of the House. Each renewal threatened to lower the drawbridge against abolition-related discussion still further. Undeterred, Adams shifted tactics with a combination of parliamentary creativity and constitutional logic. He began introducing a massive stream of petitions from citizens up and down the eastern seaboard, often exploiting procedural loopholes to bring them before the chamber in ways that circumvented the gag rule's narrow wording. Adams even presented petitions from groups that pro-slavery representatives presumed would be non-controversial, such as women praying for the rights of all citizens, then used the resulting discourse to highlight the gag rule's injustice. These moves were more than technical tricks. They were public demonstrations that no parliamentary rule could seize the people's fundamental right to be heard. At times, the House tried to push back. In February 1842, members brought a motion to censure Adams for his persistence, accusing him of provoking conflict and violating decorum. Adams turned even that challenge into a platform, using his time to deliver extended denunciations of the gag rule and its defenders. By baiting his opponents into lengthy debate, he transformed repression into exposure, forcing the chamber to confront the moral stakes embedded in procedural minutiae. Throughout this prolonged struggle, spanning nearly a decade, Adams framed his opposition not simply as hostility to slavery, but as a defense of constitutional liberty itself. He reminded the chamber that the right to petition belonged to all people, including those without the vote or social power, and that without open debate, the Republic risked betraying its founding ideals. Though the gag rule would remain in force until December 3, 1844, Adams's relentless parliamentary and legal maneuvers had sapped its legitimacy. Every motion, every debate, every cleverly framed petition built momentum against it, building a broader coalition in the North that saw the rule not as neutral procedure, but as censorship in the service of human bondage. When the rule was finally rescinded, it was not merely Adams's victory in Congress. It was a triumph for the constitutional ethos he had defended at every turn.
Chapter 7. Constitutional Warrior. Framing Rights as the Heart of the Republic. Under the steady glow of oil lamps in the Capitol's corridors, John Quincy Adams came to understand that his fight against the gag rule was not merely a dispute over procedure. It was a defense of the Republic's constitutional core. In the years after the rule's passage in 1836, Adams persisted in presenting petitions and challenging every parliamentary barrier put up to silence them. But his struggle went deeper. He framed his resistance in terms of free speech, conscience, and the right to petition, foundations of American liberty itself. What followed was an extended battle not just over slavery, but over the very meaning of citizenship and constitutional rights in the young republic. From the earliest days of the crisis, Adams anchored his arguments in the First Amendment's guarantee that Congress shall make no law abridging the right of the people to petition the government for a redress of grievances. When the gag rule automatically tabled anti-slavery petitions without debate, Adams did not merely see a frustrating parliamentary tactic. He saw a direct violation of this sacred right. In his motion of May 27, 1836, he
he declared that the gag rule was not only contrary to House rules, but also in direct violation of the Constitution of the United States. To Adams, the right to petition was not a luxury for the powerful or influential, but a right that belongs to humanity itself, a voice of conscience that transcended social rank, race, and status. He argued that even those who could not vote, women, free blacks, and even enslaved people, possessed a claim to have their grievances heard by the nation's legislature. In emphasizing this universal dimension, Adams expanded the American understanding of petitioning beyond simple political mechanics. He grounded it in something more fundamental: the moral agency of every human being. Throughout the late 1830s and early 1840s, Adams repeatedly invoked these constitutional principles from the House floor. He reminded colleagues that the right to petition was woven into the very fabric of the Republic, evident not only in the First Amendment, but also in the earliest colonial charters and the Declaration of Independence itself, where the right to appeal to government was a central grievance against King George III. This historical lineage, Adams asserted, was essential to preserving a government of the people rather than a government that could arbitrarily block the people's voice. Adams's rivals often tried to bait him into purely sectional debates about slavery. Instead, he elevated his arguments to constitutional questions. If Congress could silence petitions on one issue, what limitation could restrain it from silencing others? Would the right to petition, like so many other liberties, be eroded by legislative fiat?
Adams knew that the future health of the nation's democratic experiment depended on an unassailable defense of these bedrock principles. This constitutional framing won him unlikely allies and gradually eroded the gag rule's support. Northern Whigs and even some Northern Democrats came to see the rule not just as a regional imposition, but as a threat to universal civil liberties that all Americans, regardless of geography, held dear. Adams's long-pursued motion to repeal the gag rule finally succeeded in 1844, a testament to his unrelenting defense of constitutional ideals over expedient silence. In this chapter of his life, Adams was neither merely an anti-slavery advocate nor a procedural logician. He was, above all, a constitutional warrior, insisting that the soul of American liberty could not be extinguished by parliamentary rule or political pressure, and that the right to speak, petition, and conscience was the indispensable heart of the Republic.
Chapter 8. Enemies in the Chamber. Clash of Ideologies and Personal Hostility. In the mid-1830s, it has to be the personal names strict about the dealing buildings and personal hostility. In the mid-1830s, strict about the norm in the chamber. In the world middle 18, the very child generations of long time, in the mid-1830s, strict about the norms of groups and personal hostility. In the mid-1830s, strict about the 17, the very stranged removed. In the next 1830s, strict about 30 in the chamber. In the mid-1830s, strict about 30 in the chamber. In the mid-1830s, strict about 30 in the chamber. In the mid-1830s, strict about 30 in the chamber. In the 1830s, strict about 30 in the chamber, the very field flash and personal hostility. In the 1830s, strict about 6,000 alder. In the mid-1830s, strict about 30 in the chamber. U.S. House of Representatives,
was not just a legislative body. It was a crucible of the nation's deepest moral conflicts. As John Quincy Adams ramped up his relentless challenge to the gag rule, the set of House resolutions that automatically tabled any petitions concerning slavery, the chamber became a battlefield of ideology, regional pride, and personal animosity. Former colleagues who once greeted him with polite respect now regarded him as a relentless irritant, someone who unsettled the uneasy peace Southern legislators had constructed to protect their interests. From the outset, pro-slavery representatives saw Adams's advocacy as a direct threat to their way of life. Though Adams insisted he was defending constitutional rights rather than attacking slavery per se, his persistence in presenting anti-slavery petitions and arguing against gag rules grated fiercely against Southern sensibilities. They perceived his actions as an unwelcome accusation and a challenge to their honor, a word that carried tremendous weight in antebellum politics. Adams once reportedly demanded of the Speaker, "Am I gagged or am I not?" in dramatic fashion, after being denied recognition to speak on the floor, a moment that crystallized the deep divide between him and his Southern opponents. Among his most vocal adversaries was Henry A. Wise of Virginia, who embodied the fury of Southern legislators. Wise, a fiery orator and stalwart defender of slavery, was known to Adams's diary as loud, vociferous, declamatory, furibund, characterizing his opponent's outrage at Adams's challenges to the gag rule and his defense of petition rights. Wise later earned infamy for his role in a deadly duel on the fringes of Congress, a stark reminder of how personal honor and political conflict were dangerously entwined in this era. The rancor was not confined to shouting matches and cold stares. In February 1842, a motion was introduced to censure Adams, a formal rebuke intended to punish him for what Southern members portrayed as anti-slavery agitation. Adams deftly turned the proceedings to his advantage, launching into a weeks-long defense that transformed the censure attempt into a forum for denunciations of slavery and its defenders. His masterful use of procedural time infuriated his opponents and won grudging respect from those who saw his constitutional arguments as earnest, if relentless. Ultimately, the House tabled the censure motion, a symbolic defeat for his adversaries. In quieter moments, the toll of these clashes was personal. Adams received death threats for his stand against the gag rule, warnings that showed how heated and perilous congressional debate over slavery had become even before the Civil War.
The intimidation underscored not only the ideological chasm between North and South, but how deeply the issue of slavery had infiltrated every corner of American political life. Yet Adams never backed down. Each attempt to silence him, each personal attack, only sharpened his resolve. The House chamber, once a place of routine governance, had become a staging ground for one of the nation's most intense ideological battles, one that foreshadowed the greater conflict soon to engulf the entire republic. In facing these enemies, Adams embodied the collision between conscience and power, bringing into sharp relief the human and political stakes of the fight over slavery's meaning in America. Chapter 9. The Petition from the Enslaved. Courage in the Voice of the Voiceless. In the long-shadowed struggle over slavery in the 1830s and 1840s, one moment stood out not just for its procedural audacity, but for its emotional and symbolic power. Among the tens of thousands of anti-slavery petitions arriving at the U.S. House of Representatives during the era of the gag rule, one set of signatures challenged the very assumptions of the chamber. A petition
from enslaved people themselves. When John Quincy Adams attempted to introduce it, the reaction was immediate, visceral, and unforgettable. By the late 1830s, the capital was inundated with petitions originating from all walks of life. Abolitionist societies, women's associations, and thousands of everyday citizens in the North had taken up the quill to protest slavery and to demand that Congress take action. In one single session, more than 130,000 such petitions were sent to the House, creating a deluge that overwhelming numbers of representatives, particularly from the South, tried to silence with the gag rule, which automatically tabled any anti-slavery communication without debate. Among Adams's fiercest arguments against the gag rule was his unshakable belief that the right to petition belonged to all people, men and women, free and enslaved alike. To him, that right was not a matter of convenience. It was fundamental to the Republic. And so, in 1837, he asked the Speaker whether it was in order to present a petition from 22 enslaved individuals. The effect was electric. Southern congressmen burst to their feet, brandishing threats of censure and even suggestions that the petition be torn up or burned rather than acknowledged. The uproar revealed, more starkly than ever before, how deeply the question of slavery had split the nation's conscience. The dramatic scene illustrated both the courage and the vulnerability of those still in bondage. These were people literally denied citizenship, property, and the protection of law. Yet they seized the revolutionary promise of the American experiment to petition their own government, an act suffused with moral force. Adams may have been their conduit, but their words were a testament to the undeniable presence of human agency, even under the weight of chains. Their petition forced the House to confront what it meant to silence not just opinions, but human voices. Adams, ever the constitutionalist, deftly turned the controversy into a broader argument about the First Amendment and the rights of petitioners. He reminded the chamber that if even those without political power, including enslaved people, could not have their grievances heard, then the Republic had betrayed its founding principles. Though the gag rule continued for years, this episode sharpened the moral and political stakes of the broader struggle. It showed that the fight over slavery was not an abstract policy debate, but a battle for the humanity of those who had been stripped of it. In that moment, the voices of the voiceless echoed most loudly in the halls of power, challenging the conscience of a nation still wrestling with its highest ideals. Chapter 10. The Amistad Case. Freedom, Law, and the Courtroom Drama. In the autumn of 1839, the story of the schooner La Amistad burst into the national spotlight, not simply as another seaborne tragedy of the Atlantic slave trade, but as a legal battle that would strike at the heart of American ideals. Off the coast of Cuba, a group of West Africans had been kidnapped, illegally sold into slavery, and loaded aboard the Spanish schooner Amistad for transport to a plantation. Led by Sengbe Pie, known to friends as Joseph Cinque, they seized control of the vessel, killing its captain and cook in the process of reclaiming their freedom. Their attempt to sail back to Africa went awry, and the ship was captured by a U.S. naval vessel off Long Island. The Africans were taken to Connecticut and imprisoned, initiating a case that would journey through the courts to the Supreme Court of the United States. At first, the legal fight focused on whether the Africans were property or free individuals. Because the Atlantic slave trade had been abolished by the United States and Great Britain,
It was argued that these men had been illegally enslaved before ever reaching Cuba. A federal district court in Connecticut ruled that they should be freed and returned to Africa, and that decision was upheld in the circuit court. But when the U.S. government, under pressure from Spain and seeking to maintain diplomatic relations, appealed to the Supreme Court, the fate of Cinque and his fellow Africans hung in the balance. At this critical moment, John Quincy Adams, then a 73-year-old member of the House of Representatives and already renowned for his defense of constitutional rights, was asked by abolitionists to present the Africans' case before the nation's highest tribunal. Though decades had passed since he had practiced law, Adams agreed, recognizing the moral and constitutional stakes. In a lengthy and impassioned argument that stretched over several days beginning on February 24, 1841, he attacked the government's position that treaty obligations to Spain should override fundamental human rights. Adams insisted that the captives had been illegally taken from Africa, that no treaty could strip them of their natural rights, and that the Declaration of Independence itself, which enshrined the right to life and liberty, was the true guiding law in the case. Adams did not merely argue technical legal points. He placed the case in the broader context of justice and conscience. Standing before the justices, he famously invoked the Declaration of Independence, saying that no law or treaty should be permitted to contradict its core affirmation that every person has an inalienable right to freedom. This was a compelling moral challenge to a nation that still permitted slavery within its borders. On March 9, 1841, the Supreme Court handed down its decision. The Africans aboard the Amistad were free.
The court ruled that they had been illegally enslaved and therefore had the right to resist and to regain their freedom. The decision, reached by a 7-1 margin, affirmed the lower court's judgments in favor of the captives. Though the federal government did not fund their return home, abolitionist supporters raised the necessary funds. In January 1842, the surviving 35 Africans, including Cinque, finally sailed back to Sierra Leone. Their departure was a poignant closure to a case that had stretched the limits of American law, human dignity, and the promises of freedom. In the annals of American history, the Amistad Case stands not only as a remarkable legal victory, but also as a testament to what a nation could aspire to be when law, conscience, and courage converged, and as one of the defining moments in Adams's second, extraordinary career of public service. Chapter 11. Victory over silence, repealing the gag rule. In the waning days of 1844, it may be about victory over the justum, again another supportant. In the world, will handle to the right of a global victory. In the first chapter, 1844, in the way that the justum still that is another Sunday of Justin support by the stream and crowd. In the world of the chapter is the video of the Justin still. In the world of the chapter as the video convention to the Justin still. In the chapter 11, 500 still has specially take my Justin still. In the way of the Justin is the video convention to the Justin still. In the world, would not provide the Justin still, did not provide the Justin still, with Justin still. In the beginning the chapter, there 500 still is a peacely no constraim. In the world of the chapter, supporters realize the chapter of the Justin still. In the brick of the Justin still, they will go ahead and terrible to play. In the dream the chapter, not left in 1844. In the world of the Justin, they will no one have been fined by a just and still. In the second were do not provide the just and still, not just and still. Tree into the chapter. In the world slipped 1844. After nearly a decade of relentless struggle, the U.S. House of Representatives finally lifted the pall of enforced silence that had long hung over the nation's debates. The so-called gag rule, a series of parliamentary resolutions adopted beginning in 1836 that automatically tabled any petition relating to slavery without reading, discussion, or referral, was rescinded at last. It was a triumph not only for those who opposed censorship, but for the deeply held constitutional principle that the people's voices should not be stifled by procedural fiat. At the heart of this victory stood John Quincy Adams, the former president whose unflagging persistence against the gag rule had transformed a contentious political maneuver into one of the most dramatic constitutional battles in congressional history. For years, Southern lawmakers and their allies had pushed the gag rule in an effort to quarantine the institution of slavery from the national legislative agenda. Tens of thousands of anti-slavery petitions, signed by everyday citizens from towns and farms across the North, had deluged the Capitol, demanding discussion of slavery's abolition or mitigation. Rather than engage with these appeals, pro-slavery members resorted to tabling them without debate, seeking to silence not only the petitions themselves, but the very idea that the peculiar institution could be questioned on the House floor. Adams viewed this as an affront to the First Amendment's guarantee of the right to petition the government for a redress of grievances. For him, the right to petition was more than procedural language. It was a foundational principle of Republican governance. Over the course of 8 long years, he fought to delegitimize the gag rule through constitutional argument, procedural challenges, and sheer moral force. Year after year, the rule was renewed, sometimes under different names or as revised House rules. But each renewal represented a new opportunity for Adams to expose its inconsistency with the nation's highest principles. The tide began to turn in 1844. Adams and his allies on a special House Rules Committee successfully drafted a set of procedural rules that omitted the gag and reflected opposition to enforced silence. Although initial votes to adopt these rules were blocked, the building momentum against the gag revealed shifting attitudes in Congress. Finally, on December 3, 1844, Adams introduced a resolution to rescind the gag rule, then House Rule 25. This time, the House declined to lay the resolution on the table, a procedural move that had thwarted previous attempts, and instead voted 108 to 80 in favor of repeal. When the final tally was announced, Adams, now in his 70s, felt the long years of struggle vindicated. In his diary, he recorded the moment with heartfelt gratitude, praising not only the procedural victory, but the reaffirmation of a constitutional right so central to the American experiment. What had begun as an attempt by some to crush dissent had instead highlighted the power of persistent advocacy grounded in constitutional conviction. The repeal of the gag rule marked a turning point in congressional history. It was a clear rebuke to the notion that debate on moral and political issues could be shut down by a simple rule.
and it laid important groundwork for future conflicts over slavery and civil liberties. Adams's long battle was not merely a personal crusade, but a dramatic assertion that the voice of the people, however uncomfortable it might be for some, must be heard in the nation's halls of power.
Chapter 12. A Nation Divided, Texas, Expansion, and the Conflict over Slavery. By the 1877, attuned the Texas expansion. Of the late 1836, in the 1837, should now weigh a bloom the track. By the late 1833, the Texas expansion forbottomed the most made visible of the program. Most of the arts accompanitions to the 1836, it presents the large of language. The first of the buildie, the great of Texas included on the lenk. But the buildie's skills, the stronger the to mark to the prout, and a voive midlist filtered. The list from other reflective governs, the Texas especially come from. By the late 1833 is a 2.5 of the first filter. The first trackety, the traded villages village of a mental discoverably the revility. Chapter 12. A Nation Divided, Texas, Expansion, and the Conflict over Slavery. Texas, expansion, and the late 1830s, the United States was no longer merely a young republic finding its footing. It was a nation splitting at the seams over territory, identity, and the future of human bondage. At the heart of this fracturing stood an issue that seemed simple on the surface, but combustible in consequence: the annexation of Texas. For many Southern politicians eager to expand the institution of slavery and gain additional political power in Congress, embracing Texas as a U.S. state was a logical next chapter. For others, including John Quincy Adams, the seasoned statesman now serving in the House of Representatives, it was a moral and constitutional danger that could tear the nation apart. Texas had won its independence from Mexico in 1836, but its status as a sprawling territory, sparsely populated by Americans, yet deeply committed to slavery, made its future uncertain. Southern leaders viewed annexation as a way to extend slavery's reach and bolster their representation in the Senate. Northern states, however, feared that adding another slave state would shift the balance of power and intensify the sectional clash already developing over human bondage. Adams, long familiar with the constitutional and moral foundations of the nation, opposed annexation early and consistently. In years of speeches beginning in the late 1830s, he framed the debate not as abstract territory politics, but as a question of national character and human rights. For Adams, Texas was more than open land. It was a political instrument that, if admitted as a slaveholding state, would expand the reach of slavery and deepen the country's moral crisis. He argued that the nation's founders could not have intended for the extension of bondage to be part of the American project. Adams insisted that honoring the Declaration of Independence's affirmation of liberty required resisting moves that would widen slavery's scope. In 1838, Adams and a committee of like-minded legislators filibustered Congress for nearly 3 weeks, speaking out against Texas annexation, the gag rule, and the acceleration of pro-slavery policies. His speeches stirred public opinion and helped delay annexation measures for a time, revealing how deeply this issue had now entered the national conscience. The fight over Texas became a central theme of the 1844 presidential election, when annexation was pushed by outgoing President John Tyler,
and championed by Democratic nominee James K. Polk, with the promise of expanding U.S. territory all the way to the Pacific. Adams supported his old ally Henry Clay, but was deeply disappointed when Polk won. Subsequently, Congress approved the annexation of Texas as a state in 1845, a move Adams had described as risking a war for slavery.
The annexation itself did not just add land. It ignited deeper conflict over whether new territories should permit slavery, a question that would soon erupt into the Mexican-American War and later into the crisis over the Wilmot Proviso. As the nation grew, so too did the divisions within it, splitting Americans along ideological and moral lines. For Adams, the Texas question was never merely political. It was a litmus test for the Republic's soul. He saw the acquisition of Texas not simply as expansion, but as a dangerous commitment to a future where slavery's spread would define American identity. In opposing it, he stood at the forefront of the widening national divide, one that would shape the political landscape for years to come. Chapter 13. Science, Knowledge, and Legacy. A Vision Beyond Abolition. In the swirl of political combat that defined John Quincy Adams's post-presidential career, there was another thread to his public life, one that stretched beyond abolition, procedural battles, and personal hostility. Long before the gag rule and the Amistad Case, Adams had cultivated a deep belief that a republic's strength depends not only on justice, but on knowledge, science, and education. Even as his days in the House grew consumed with moral conflict, he carried this belief into the legislative chambers, where he became a persistent champion for learning, discovery, and national institutions of knowledge. Adams's fascination with science and culture was not an afterthought. It was born in his earliest years. Educated at Harvard and fluent in multiple languages, he was shaped by European intellectual currents and recognized that the pursuit of knowledge was essential to national progress. During his presidency in the 1820s, he proposed ambitious initiatives, including a national observatory and a national university, reflecting his conviction that scientific advancement and broad education were vital to America's future. While these ideas met resistance and largely failed to materialize at the time, they laid important ideological groundwork for later achievements. The most enduring legacy of this intellectual vision came through Adams's work surrounding the bequest of James Smithson, the British scientist whose estate was left to the United States to establish an institution for the increase and diffusion of knowledge among men. When Smithson's nephew died without heirs in 1835, the federal government faced a choice: accept the gift and create an enduring national institution, or divert the funds elsewhere. Adams, then a congressman, saw in this bequest a rare opportunity to realize the dream of a national center for learning and scientific inquiry. As chairman of the House committee charged with handling Smithson's legacy, Adams fought fiercely to protect and preserve the bequest. The funds, initially invested in volatile state bonds that soon defaulted, were at risk of being lost to debt or diverted to other purposes. Adams marshaled constitutional argument, historical precedent, and moral appeal to persuade Congress that the money should be set aside intact for its intended purpose. His advocacy was decisive in restoring the lost funds with interest and convincing lawmakers that the federal government had both the authority and the responsibility to accept the gift. In 1846, thanks in large part to Adams's tireless efforts, Congress voted to establish the Smithsonian Institution, a museum, research center, library, and laboratory dedicated to the pursuit of knowledge. The institution was designed to be non-political and broadly inclusive,
reflecting Adams's belief that science and culture should serve all citizens, not just elites.
Even in this realm, Adams faced opposition. Some contemporaries mocked his passion for astronomy and scholarly pursuits as impractical or overly idealistic. Yet his perseverance helped cultivate a national appreciation for scientific exploration and intellectual inquiry. Beyond the Smithsonian, his earlier support for observatories and scientific societies helped lay the groundwork for American participation in global scientific discovery. Thus, in the midst of his moral crusades against slavery and procedural battles in Congress, Adams also carved out a legacy of learning. His efforts ensured that the early republic did not neglect the advance of knowledge, a foundation upon which generations of scholars, scientists, and citizens could build. In a nation torn by discord, he remained convinced that the increase and diffusion of knowledge was as crucial to America's destiny as the defense of liberty itself.
Chapter 14. Final Battle. Old Man Eloquent versus the Mexican-American War. In the turbulent mid-1840s, as debate over slavery's expansion continued to tear at the seams of the American Republic, another crisis flared that would test the nation's moral compass and constitutional ideals. This time, the battleground was not a procedural rule or a flood of petitions, but war itself, the Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848. For John Quincy Adams, the former president and indefatigable congressman, this conflict represented the culmination of everything he had warned against. A war driven by expansionist ambition and the spread of slavery, wrapped in the rhetoric of national destiny. The origins of the conflict lay in the annexation of Texas and the simmering territorial disputes along its border. What many in Washington framed as a defensive necessity quickly morphed into a campaign of conquest as President James K. Polk pressed the nation toward open hostilities with Mexico, claiming Mexican forces had shed American blood on American soil. For most members of Congress, this was sufficient cause for war, but not for Adams. He saw this justification as specious, a pretext to seize vast new lands where the institution of slavery could be strengthened and entrenched further. This most unrighteous war, he thundered on the House floor, denouncing the conflict as one of aggression, expansion, and sectional advantage rather than genuine defense. When the declaration of war came to a vote on May 13, 1846, Adams stood among a tiny minority who opposed it. Only 13 representatives voted against the measure, but Adams's no was more than a solitary dissent. It was consistent with decades of warnings that territorial expansion invariably became a vehicle for the extension of slavery's power. Even as the war progressed and national sentiment rallied around battlefield successes, Adams refused to soften his stance. He continued to speak out against the conflict's moral implications and the constitutional dangers it posed. To Adams, the war was dangerous for two intertwined reasons. It violated the Republican principle that war should be a last resort and not an instrument of expansion, and it paved the way for slavery's spread into new territories, a development that would intensify sectional tensions even further. His speeches in the House blurred the lines between foreign policy and moral philosophy, arguing that the war betrayed the ideals of liberty and consent that undergirded the American experiment. North and South, he warned, was sliding toward a catastrophic collision that no legislative compromise could avert if the nation kept extending the reach of human bondage. Yet as the years of conflict dragged on, the physical toll on Adams became increasingly evident. Now well into his 70s and bearing the scars of countless battles, procedural, constitutional, and moral, his frame weakened, but his voice did not.
Even as he opposed war appropriations and admonished his colleagues to consider the human cost of conquest, he faced the weariness of age.
and the judgment of a country that was, for the moment, captivated by the fervor of expansion. It was during this fraught period, on February 21st, 1848, that Adams delivered his final public act of resistance. Standing on the floor of the House, he rose not to debate party politics or procedural rules, but to oppose a motion to decorate generals who had served in the Mexican War, figures he saw as instruments of an unjust policy. It was in the midst of this last confrontation that Adams suffered a cerebral stroke, collapsing on the chamber floor, a dramatic and fitting end to a life lived in relentless defense of principle. 2 days later, on February 23rd, 1848, John Quincy Adams died in the Capitol, still surrounded by the echoes of debate and conscience. His last stand, against war, against the expansion of bondage, against the silencing of moral discourse, was emblematic of a public life shaped not by expedience, but by conviction. In resisting the Mexican-American War, he reaffirmed what he had long believed, that the preservation of freedom and justice should always come before the lure of territory and power. His passing marked the end of an era, but his warnings about expansion and slavery would resonate ever more loudly as the nation rushed toward its own tragic reckoning. Chapter 15. On the Floor of the House. A life's work ends in service. In the winter of 1848, the United 16, from a central floor of the House, institute for the Budden 1430 of a very night. In the winter of 1848, it couldn't want a first to the Budden 1430 of a bit of bread. In the Budden 30 is following to these in the winter of 1848. In the Budden 14, the dogger of floor of the last traitor of the land and Creta. In the winter of 1848, the floor of the House is the more standing that the dogger of 23. The past of the 1349 is also difficult to this. In the winter of 1848, the great of Lowndes and any friend is explained by a cobed floor and advises. In the winter of 1848, the United States Capitol was alive with the rhythms of debate and legislation, the echoes of national ambition and deep moral conflict. Among the figures moving through its corridors was a man now in his early 80s, slight and bowed by years, but still sharp of eye and voice. John Quincy Adams, known to his colleagues as Old Man Eloquent. For 17 years after his presidency, Adams had served unwaveringly in the House of Representatives, shaping debates on slavery, constitutional rights, territorial expansion, and the nation's moral direction. But no moment would be as poignant, dramatic, or symbolically powerful as the last. On February 21st, 1848, the House was considering a motion to honor officers who had served in the Mexican-American War, a conflict Adams had long opposed as unjust and dangerous in its implications for slavery and national character. As the roll was called and voices rose in favor, Adams, frail but resolute, vocalized his dissent with a force that belied his years, crying, "No!" before rising to address the speaker. In that instant, with the chamber's attention upon him, he was struck by a massive cerebral hemorrhage and collapsed at his desk, amid the very debate that represented his final public stance. The scene that followed was one of hushed urgency. Members of the House gathered around, aides and officers helped carry him from the chamber to the rotunda, and then to the Speaker's room in the Capitol, where he was placed upon a sofa. Even in the grip of illness, Adams showed his composed spirit. Witnesses later recalled that he whispered words of gratitude to the officers of the House for their service, a testament to his enduring affection for the institution he had served longer than nearly any other politician of his age. Then, after slipping into unconsciousness, he lay in the Capitol's silent shadows. For 2 days, crowds gathered outside the Capitol and flowed through its chambers to pay silent tribute as news spread of his condition. The nascent technology of the electric telegraph ensured that reports of his collapse and imminent death, rare in their immediacy, reached towns and cities across the nation, making Adams's final moments a matter of widespread public attention. In the evening of February 23, 1848, with his wife Louisa at his side, John Quincy Adams died in the Capitol at the age of 80, not in retirement or obscurity, but in the act of service that had defined his final years. The ensuing reaction was profound. The Speaker formally announced his death to the assembled House, honoring a seat and a voice that had become inseparable from the nation's ongoing struggle with liberty, conscience, and constitutional rights. In Washington and beyond, newspapers filled their pages with tributes to a life spent in public service.
A funeral service was held in the House chamber itself, bringing together friends, political rivals, and citizens to commemorate his long career. Later, his remains were laid temporarily in the public vault at Congressional Cemetery before being transported to Quincy, Massachusetts, where he was interred alongside his parents. John Quincy Adams had lived through the earliest years of the Republic, shaped its foreign policy, graced its highest office, and then returned to the common chamber of governance to fight for rights and conscience. His final breath, drawn within the Capitol, was a fitting coda. A statesman who died at his post amid the ceaseless debates and moral tumult of his nation. Epilogue. Legacy of a relentless conscience. As the sun set on the long career of John Quincy Adams, history came to recognize that his post-presidential life, spent as a congressman in the House of Representatives, was not a quiet epilogue to a statesman's career, but a defining chapter that reshaped his legacy and resonated for generations. After leaving the presidency in 1829, Adams refused a life of retirement, instead choosing to serve among ordinary legislators, where he became one of the most consequential defenders of constitutional rights, human dignity, and the very principles that sustained the Republic. In those 17 years in Congress, Adams stood between silence and expression, between repression and conscience. His fight against the gag rule, the set of parliamentary resolutions that forbade discussion of slavery in the House, was emblematic of his broader struggle for free speech and the right to petition. Where others saw procedure, Adams saw principle, arguing that the people's right to be heard was an unalienable foundation of American democracy. In exerting himself year after year, motion after motion, he not only helped dismantle the gag rule in 1844, but also helped shift the national conversation toward liberty and civil rights. His argument before the Supreme Court in the Amistad Case in 1841 remains one of the most stirring moments in legal history. Representing Africans who had seized their captor's ship in a bid for freedom, Adams invoked the nation's highest ideals, including the Declaration of Independence's affirmation of the right to liberty, and won a decision affirming their freedom. It was more than courtroom litigation. It was an act of moral witness to the world that the American experiment could uphold the rights of the oppressed, even when the political calculus suggested otherwise. But Adams's contributions extended beyond the politics of slavery. His deep belief in the increase and diffusion of knowledge moved him to safeguard and champion the Smithsonian Institution, ensuring that James Smithson's bequest would become an enduring American center for scientific inquiry and learning. In advocating for science, education, and cultural flourishing, he helped shape institutions that would benefit countless generations. Historians now see in his post-presidential career a man propelled not by ambition, but by moral conviction.
a figure who refused to step back from the nation's gravest dilemmas, and instead leaned into them with eloquence and unrelenting resolve. While he was never technically part of the abolitionist movement as it would later be defined, his actions helped inspire those who would press forward towards emancipation and civil liberties in the decades before the Civil War. He demonstrated that the fight for justice could be pursued within the halls of power, even when that power seemed indifferent or hostile.
As we reflect on his life from the quiet corridors of history, Adams's legacy reminds us that service never ends at the threshold of office, and that the protection of liberty often requires persistence far beyond the spotlight. His life's final chapter, full of battles for speech, rights, knowledge, and human dignity, stands as an enduring testament to the power of principle over convenience. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the life and legacy of John Quincy Adams, don't forget to subscribe for more stories from history's crossroads. Drop a comment with which moment in Adams's journey moved you most. I'd love to hear what you think.